Hello, welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof channel. This will be on YouTube. And this video is about making metaphors. I think a lot of times when we think about metaphor, we're probably led to think about something that's poetic, something that's kind of fancy, and something that's ancillary to the business of serious communication. Metaphors are kind of like a garnish on the plate. They're not really part of the main idea of what you're trying to say. I think that this is not true. I think this is not a good view of metaphor. And one of the reasons I think that is that a lot of people who have reflected really deeply on where language came from, a lot of the theory of how language emerges, that a language emerges through metaphor. And that's a subject for another video. This goes back to really even ancient theories of language, but that metaphor is really right at the source of meaning. When human beings are trying to make meaning out of the world, they have to create metaphor. And that maybe is a little counterintuitive because you think, well, metaphor is something that isn't direct. It doesn't refer to something directly. That's what we tend to think about when we think about basic language. I point at something and I make a sound, and that's how it works. But all that aside, I think that even if you don't have this maybe highfalutin idea of, oh, what's the origin of language? Language emerges from metaphor. Metaphor might be really still very important for coming up with things to say, for discovering new angles on a topic, and even for problem solving. That if you want to get out of the box, thinking outside of the box sometimes, well, what does that really mean? Does that mean just kind of putting a lot of effort into thinking? I don't think that's really out of the box. And speaking of boxes, we're going to start in this with talking about a well-known, if not a very good metaphor, that life is like a box of chocolates. And we're going to try to take that box of chocolates outside of its own box. So I want to go through a few of the terms I'll use in the video to describe metaphor. We have these strange terms. They come to us. I'm not sure if the first person who used them was this person named I.A. Richards. You might be familiar with probably you're not familiar with I.A. Richards. He's a little bit obscure now. He lived in the 20th century. But if you do know I.A. Richards, you might know him or his legacy if you learned English as a second language or if you learned business English, because I.A. Richards was one of the first people to try to discover, well, what are the fewest number of words that you need to know in English in order to have a conversation across languages. And this is a common thing that people still use today. But another thing that he did is he thought about all these various aspects of language. And he used these terms. Again, I don't know if he's the first person to use vehicle and tenor. So in the metaphor, life is like a box of chocolates. Life is the tenor, not the alto, not the bass, but the tenor. It's just a joke. It holds what we are trying to talk about. It's really the subject of what we're talking about. And the vehicle of our metaphor is this, in this case, the box of chocolates. So one of the things that we're going to do, if we're going to really break down what this process involves, is that we try to find predicates. And I've talked about predicates in another video on characterization. Predicates are really anything you would put after that is. Life is what? But if we put, say, a box of chocolates is, the things that we could put after both is, life is, a box of chocolate is, would be predicates that they share. So usually we'll begin with the vehicle, actually, if we're thinking of trying to find a good metaphor. Well, what are some things I can say about a box of chocolates? It's sweet. So I might say life is like a box of chocolates. It's sweet. That's not a particularly good metaphor. One of the reasons why is because a lot of things are sweet. Why did you pick box of chocolates? So you want to have a kind of tighter fit between the vehicle and the tenor. If I could say life is like a bowl of cherries, I mean, we already have that, right? It's sweet. That's not particularly interesting. But if I say life is like a bowl of cherries, it's sweet until you get to the pit. Now it's a little bit more interesting. We have some of the complication there. And so one of the things we want to do is not just find a single predicate that they share, but a number of predicates that allow us to elaborate an idea about, in this case, life or love, whatever it may be, whatever the tenor is of our metaphor. And I've done this in one of my classes recently, and I thought that some of the answers that people had were pretty good. So, of course, in the movie Forrest Gump, he completes this by saying, "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get." Again, not a great metaphor, because if he's referring to the Whitman sampler, which I assume is, for most Americans, the prototypical box of chocolates, it says it right there on the top. You can just look at the top and see what kind of chocolates you're about to get. So, I mean, maybe Forrest Gump has a different kind of box of chocolates. Maybe he's more familiar with See's candy or something. I don't know. But to me, that doesn't seem very true of a box of chocolates. You do know what you're going to get. And sometimes in life you do. So I don't think it's a great metaphor. But one thing you can do is take like an old tired metaphor and try to complete it in a new way. Now, don't get on my case about this being a simile, not a metaphor. That's not important at all. I know some people think this is really important. It's really not important. Let's let that go. Okay. So one that I really liked that someone said in my class is, life is like a box of chocolates. Try to type it out as I talk it. You have to eat the worst to know what the best is. I think that this is better than the original for a lot of reasons. Oops. I think that it's better than the original for a lot of reasons. I think that you have one thing is a kind of nice antithesis between the worst and the best, but it also has a kind of wisdom in it, in that the best might not be something that is obvious. You actually, and that bad experiences help you to understand something about life. And in fact, that rings are truer to me, because if it was said just about life, bad things in life help you to know what is good, it would sound maybe a little bit, I don't know, condescending. But when put into this metaphor where the vehicle is a box of chocolates, that experience of like, ooh, I don't really love the coconut cream chocolate, but it makes me appreciate the caramel cream a lot better. That one seems a little bit more to my palate, so to speak. So I like that one. Another one is, you could say, it's best given to someone else. You know, why do you really get a box of chocolates? So you get a box of chocolates because, you know, it's a romantic gift or something to let someone know that you care. If you just want to eat chocolates, probably better to just get a chocolate bar, I guess. I don't know. Maybe some people really like a box of chocolates, but you could see that gives a new kind of completion to the metaphor that life is like a box of chocolates. And you could try this out yourself. You could give lots of different ones. People had some very funny ones in the class. People had some very serious ones. I think that a good metaphor, when we're just really talking about literally about a metaphor, it tends to be a little bit punchy. If it's very long, if it requires a lot of elaboration or explanation to get to, you might want to work on a little bit. You might want to work on the phrasing of it. And I think metaphors can always be improved. You can always fiddle around with various things. But that's the basic idea. You're trying to find the shared predicate between the vehicle and the tenor. Why would it not be okay to just have one predicate that's shared? So we can do an example of a bad one. Lightning is a tiger. It is fast. Okay, this is a bad metaphor. Why is this bad? It's bad because, first of all, if you know something about lightning, you probably know that it's fast. It's electrical current. It's about as fast as it can be. In fact, it's faster than the tiger. So it doesn't tell us anything new. And in fact, it kind of seems to reduce the speed of light to something that's not like it very much. And so even though they share the predicate fast, you can say that both of them are fast. That's true. It doesn't kind of capture the way that it is fast. So that's one reason it's bad. It's also they don't seem to have very much else in common. There's nothing else that's added to it. So it's kind of a dead metaphor. It's dead on arrival, DOA. Lightning is a tiger? That's not. Even if I said tiger is a lightning, well, tiger is a lightning. Tigers are like lightning. They're fast. I mean, this is childish. You know, it just kind of takes a predicate, discovers it in something different, and puts it on top. What we want is a predicate that the way in which something is fast helps us see the way in which something else is fast. And probably fast isn't one of those predicates that's particularly interesting for this kind of development. So, and that leads us to the second part of making your metaphor. You want to elaborate the vehicle. Again, that would be the box of chocolates. So it gives a new perspective on the tenor, life in this case. So you can give a whole speech around, well, what's the way in which life is like a box of chocolates? I'm going to make a second video, and I'll put a link to in the description, where I look at one of Shakespeare's famous metaphors, that love is an ever fixed mark. This is from one of his sonnets. And he is comparing love there, and I'm not going to do the whole thing, not the whole thing right now. You can have another video you can watch. He compares the whole thing to a star. But love is a star, or love is an ever fixed mark, already shows us that the first thing that we're supposed to consider it in relationship to, it's the fixedness of the star. Maybe in particular, the North Star, you might say. It's a star that doesn't move, despite everything else in the whole world moving around it. And that elevates the way that love, the fidelity of love. That it's not just, I really care about you, I'm going to keep caring about you. It's that the whole universe, the whole cosmos might move, and this will remain the same. That gives it a depth of feeling and pathos that you wouldn't get if you just said in the simple way, love is true, love is faithful, love is kind. Kind of the St. Paul take on love that people like to read. I think Shakespeare's got a little bit of a better angle on love than St. Paul, but that's just my humble opinion. Okay, so I'll have another video on that to go through what that might look like. And of course, we're none of us is Shakespeare, but we're all, in the fact that we speak English, we're all kind of Shakespeare's children. So I think it's worth looking at an example of a really good use of metaphor, even if it's not, I don't think it's even the best use of metaphor in Shakespeare, but it's a good one and it's a famous one. So we'll take a look at that. Now, finally, how do you set that in your speech? Well, it depends on, again, always, what is your purpose for speaking? Who is your audience? And what do you want to say? But I think if you take this idea that I want to speak about something that other people have spoken about before, what's my subject? Maybe my subject is love. Maybe my subject is work. Something like that. Something that's very general. How can I speak about a general theme in a way that still feels fresh and new? Metaphor might be one of the ways that you can do that. So it's really developing an argument. You can think about metaphor as the beginning of an argument, incipient argument, an argument before it begins, right? Because what does a good argument do? It leads our audience to make inferences for themselves. And they say, wow, that seems plausible. I can see, even beyond the reasons that you've presented for your argument, I can see how that fits in with a broader picture of what I believe about the world. And therefore, I could supply my own reasons that would also support that. I mean, you've been really successful with an argument if you get your audience to that point. And metaphor kind of does this in a different way. It kind of shocks people with an image sometimes, or something that's really concrete about something that's abstract. Now, not every metaphor is about something. It's not where the tenor is abstract and the vehicle is concrete. Life, abstract. Box of chocolates, concrete. It doesn't have to be that way, but often it is. And so that might be a good place to begin. If you're thinking about a general theme, how can I develop it in a concrete way? And this argument isn't, of course, to literally prove that life is a box of chocolates. It's not. There are many ways in which it is different from a box of chocolates, but rather to elaborate that perspective that you're taking. Let's say you're taking the perspective that you have to eat the worst to know the best. Well, what would be, now going back to our tenor life, what would be an example of that you might bring? That might be a story from your experience. That might be a historical anecdote. And now you can bring in that material that is already illustrating a point that was made in the metaphor. And that gives direction to that metaphor. It gives direction to the story or anecdote that you're bringing, because that metaphor is leading the audience to make lots of inferences to try to make it work, because we tend to want to make things work. You look at an optical illusion, even though you know it's an illusion, you want to see it work. You might think of a metaphor kind of like that, or forced perspective in painting. You don't want to, you want to see the illusion working. You want to see what makes it work. So even though we know that the metaphor is, in some sense, a trompe-l'œil, it's kind of an illusion. We know that there's a difference there. We want to feel it working because it gives us a kind of aesthetic pleasure. And that aesthetic pleasure for your audience can become a direction for your whole speech. So if you take that approach, sometimes it might be wise to set that metaphor right at the beginning. And that way it allows you to develop all sorts of other things in your speech that don't maybe seem related and then come back to it. On the other hand, you might begin by talking about this really kind of concrete idea. For me, I was thinking recently about Pachysandra because growing up, I lived in a pretty, there wasn't a lot of green space in the neighborhood, but there was a little patch of Pachysandra in front of the house. And that if, when we were playing out in the street, if a ball went in there, you couldn't touch it. You couldn't get in. And that word was so strange to my ears as a kid. I thought it was Pack of Sandra. I was like, what does this have to do with women named Sandra? I was very confused. So the whole thing was kind of mysterious. And so I could take that story, I could tell you the story of my very peculiar experience with Pachysandra, and I could tell you more about it if I want, and then make that a metaphor for something else. Obviously, in order to do that, I'd have to begin with telling you this strange experience I had with Pachysandra, the kind of no man's zone. A ball went in there, you couldn't go get it. An adult had to come reach it for you. Maybe I could say, I think a lot of our democratic process is kind of like this Pachysandra. It's something we have respect for because when the normal play of what's happening in the streets leads to, as it always does, a foul ball hit over that way, we rely on certain institutions where the adults come in to go grab the ball out for us. We're not allowed to touch it. And it seems different from everything else in the neighborhood. Okay, I'm not sure if this metaphor works. Democratic institutions are like Pachysandra. I'd have to work on it a lot more, I think, in order to make it into a real argument. But you get the idea. If I was going to use something that strange, like my childhood experience, I'd have to explain it a little bit before I ask my audience to follow through with this argument. I'd have to set out the kinds of predicates that I wanted them to bring into the common experience that we maybe have of things like the judiciary or government, legislatures, whatever. So that's a really brief way of thinking about how you might make a metaphor and how you might put it in a speech. There's much more that could be said about it. And I will make a second video that really just explores how one good metaphor in Shakespeare's sonnet works. But if you like this video, let me know, and look forward to more content about metaphor and all sorts of other things about rhetoric coming in the near future.